On January 5th, 1929, Emmett Welch's famous minstrels played their last show in Philadelphia at the theater on the northwest corner of 9th and Arch Streets. "The season closes Saturday night," read a small newspaper ad in the bottom corner of that day's Philadelphia Inquirer. It was a surprisingly tiny announcement for the usually brash and enthusiastic Welch's minstrels, almost as if they merely were going through the motions of publicity, discouraged at the final demise of their company, and this was their last feeble attempt at drawing some holiday season theater goers. 2 weeks earlier, before Christmas Day 1928 at least, their ads had been a bit more prominent. "Last week of a famous Philadelphia institution," they proclaimed. "Don't miss the last performances. Old and young patrons of minstrelsy invited to attend. There would be a comedy skit called No Wedding for Me, and there would be a melodious review of 12 minutes of syncopated music, as well as numerous songs and stories. The whole evening would conclude with the, quote, laughable afterpiece entitled The Voodoo Doctor or the Fortune Teller, close quotes. There was even a special midnight show to ring in the new year of 1929. But then, 5 days later, at the end of the week, the final permanent resident blackface minstrel troupe in Philadelphia put its banjos, tambourines, and burnt cork away for the last time. It was the end of an era in the Quaker City's entertainment landscape, one that had lasted almost uninterrupted for 85 years. Hello, and welcome back to Adventures in Theater History. Today, we have a very important topic about Philadelphia theater to discuss. It's perhaps the most consequential topic we've ever taken on in terms of both its historical context and its long-term effects on the society, culture, and politics of Philadelphia. But it's definitely not one that the city is the proudest of, or that it goes out of its way to commemorate. Not anymore. Over the course of this first season of the podcast, we've already examined many examples of white performers in Philadelphia circuses and on its stages portraying people of other races and ethnicities. Ricketts Circus had clowns portraying blacks and Polynesians. The New Theater on Chestnut Street did shows about Pocahontas, or ones that were set in Turkish harems with Orientalist blackface marching bands. Not to mention all the British and American tragic actors doing Shakespeare's Othello and Aaron the Moor in blackface over the years. And most tellingly, the theater managers of the early 19th century Philadelphia stage were not at all shy about booking solo acts, delineating social and racial types that certain actors had scientifically studied, as they said. Everything from Western mountain men in coonskin hats to British aristocrats to New England Yankees to crude portrayals of urban African-American dandies, a character usually called Zip Coon, that had already been the subject of a well-known series of racist prints in a book called Life in Philadelphia. These latter solo performers were usually known as Ethiopian or Negro delineators, by the way. That was the way they signaled that it was a white person pretending to be black. African-American performers themselves were usually called colored or bona fide blacks, and I tell you this just to make clear the nomenclature of the day. Of course, the word darky was thrown around quite a lot in the 19th century, and much worse terminology was right out there in the open too. You know the word I'm talking about, but I'm not going there, I promise you. We also discussed in an episode about Edwin Forrest how avenues of advancement in theater that were opened up for ambitious and talented young American white men, such as Edwin Forrest, Philadelphia's well-known star, were not open at all for his black contemporaries elsewhere in America, such as Ira Aldridge. Aldridge, after a brief apprenticeship with the short-lived African Grove Theater in New York City, had left America as a young man, spent the entire rest of his career in Europe, having learned the hard lesson that he was not able to even think about performing on American stages. Not that his career in Europe was without difficulties, but at least it was possible. The enslavement and disenfranchisement of millions of human beings in the supposedly free and democratic American Republic were among the increasingly burning issues of the day, though a decidedly small number of white people supported both the abolition of slavery and voting rights for women. But on January 1st, 1831, in Boston, Massachusetts, the editor William Lloyd Garrison published his first issue of the anti-slavery and pro-women's rights newspaper, The Liberator. Anti-slavery societies began to be formed in many cities in America, including Philadelphia, along the lines of those that were successfully working to abolish the institution of slavery in the British Empire. The Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society was formed in 1833 by Philadelphia women, both white and black. Amongst many white working-class men of northeastern American cities like Philadelphia, however, this seemed less like a possibility of liberation from an unfortunate legacy and more like a threat. There was a feeling that a cultural elite, as the expression is often used these days, was working to undermine their economic opportunities and their social prerogatives. In August of 1831, Nat Turner's brief slave rebellion had broken out down in Virginia, and in the horrific violence and repression that followed that uprising, many free black people who weren't involved in it at all had fled the South and had moved to Philadelphia, where there was already a long-established African-American community for them to join. Many white Philadelphians found this influx alarming. The black community in the city had a significant degree of social stratification, with middle-class and even quite well-off families, but the overwhelming majority of black Philadelphians were working class. As Philadelphia's growing economic industrialization continued as the century went on, there was increasing competition between white working class and black laborers who shared many of the same neighborhoods and workplaces. Ugly anti-black riots broke out in the neighborhood south of the city in 1834 over a dispute about a carousel on the corner of 7th and South Streets. One man was killed. Many other people were assaulted and beaten, and an African Presbyterian church was looted and burned to the ground. 2 years previously, in 1832, had been the first performance on a Philadelphia stage by Thomas Rice, the delineator of the infamous singing and dancing Jim Crow character. Already a massive hit in New York and elsewhere, on July 25th, 1832, he did a highly successful run at the Walnut Street Theater. It was such a big deal that by the next month he was playing at the more prestigious Chestnut Street Theater, and he drew a great return at the box office too. Only the arrival in town of Fanny Kemble and her father that autumn were finally able to drag people's attention away. But Thomas Rice's stage career, unlike hers, continued to last. In 1835, you could find Rice again on the Chestnut Street Theater stage, performing on the same evening as a full production of Othello. As the decade of the 1830s ended, economic depression and widespread unemployment struck many American industries, including the theater industry. We've examined already how many American actors and performers, outside of the few major stars of the day, found it really difficult to make a steady and profitable living as actors. All across the nation, issues about fair wages, slavery, immigration, and race were hot-button issues. The stage was set for the next big development of American entertainment to take account of that. the minstrel show. Minstrel shows, in fact, were to rule American show business for most of the 19th century. But what do we mean exactly by a minstrel show? I don't just mean blackface performances or other aspects of racist appropriation and caricature, although that's certainly a major part of it. By the term minstrel show, I'm specifically referring to the type of fast-paced variety performances that arose in America starting in the early 1840s and perfected in the 1850s. Typically, as a minstrel show began, a line of 7 to 13 men entered and paraded to a semicircular row of chairs placed across the stage. All or most of them were dressed in a caricature of African Americans. The performers' faces, ears, and necks were covered in dark makeup. Their heads were adorned with unruly black wigs. Their mouths had either a thick red or white band around the lips. They wore white gloves and brightly colored clothes that had exaggerated lapels and large buttons. They carried musical instruments, banjos, fiddles, tambourines, and bone castanets. Sometimes there was an additional orchestra of musicians and a chorus grouped on the stage behind them. "Gentlemen, be seated," said the authority figure of the group in the center of the line, and they all would park themselves on their chairs, although they didn't stay there for long. From that point on, almost anything could happen. A series of fast-paced banter and jokes were usually passed between the two end men to the right and the left of the line, usually called Mr. Tambo and Mr. Bones, who acted as the principal comedians. Mr. Interlocutor, in the center, attempted to keep them under control, but Bones and Tambo were continually breaking free to sing songs, tell topical jokes, do monologues and quick skits, always using a highly contrived Negro dialect, an absurd parody of African American speech patterns. Soon, a deeply sentimental song about missing home and mother was performed by a sweet-faced tenor in the group, and everyone wiped away a tear. But then the tempo of the music picked up again. The group of men in the chairs sometimes sat formally, as if they were giving a concert, but as other times they moved rhythmically, danced in their seats, or left the seats entirely to do tap dances and soft shoe numbers. At the end of this section of the show, there was usually a walk-around in which the group would circle around the stage while each man got in a quick solo in which they did their signature dance move or joke. In the second part of the show, there was an olio, or variety section, during which a curtain was lowered across the proscenium, while solo performers did special turns, usually including a stump speech, an extended sermon, political oration, or pseudo-scientific lesson by a blackface performer employing numerous malapropisms and easily spotted grammatical mistakes. Sometimes a wench, a man clownishly dressed up as a woman in bloomers and carrying a parasol, would deliver a comedic diatribe against women's rights. The olio curtain was then brought up for the final part of the show, usually involving a melodrama set on a plantation, sometimes it was Uncle Tom's Cabin, or an elaborate burlesque of some other formal play like Shakespeare or the opera. Often this section had nothing to do with racial humor, but usually it did. Anyway, the overall message of the entire show was that the rural South, the plantation, and not the city, was the natural home of black people, the place where they really belonged. And in songs like "Oh Susanna" or "Dixie," which often appeared in this part of the show, it was clear that the South was where they really wanted to be. The show ended with a grand chorus and an ecstatic breakdown in which the most energetic and popular songs were played to engage the audience. The final curtain, often decorated with advertising with an image of another blackface minstrel on it, came down, and the audience was encouraged to come back again real soon, as there would be new songs, new material, and even more fun the next time around. Now, not that long ago, anywhere in America, that description I just gave would have been totally unnecessary. Everybody knew what a minstrel show was. Everybody had been to them or participated in them. Everybody. Now, I'm perfectly aware that minstrel shows and many more insidious aspects of what is usually termed minstrelsy have hardly disappeared in our present historical era, not at all. But minstrelsy is generally, and rightly, regarded as being so highly offensive and racist as to need specific content warnings whenever it is discussed in places such as classrooms or podcasts. So let me be clear at this point that I do not intend to share much specific content from historic minstrel shows that were racist or offensive in nature. Since podcasting is blessedly an oral medium, I can't share any of the images, engravings, and photos that usually accompany printed articles or online discussions of the topic. But I'm not even going to quote any lyrics or play recordings of offensive minstrel dialect songs. I'll put a few things on the website of the show in the interest of historical documentation, but I really have no interest in bringing out the worst stuff once again. They're easy to find if you want to look for them. I'm just not going to add to the appallingly huge pile. It's all out there. You don't even have to look very hard. For example, if you're a fan of old Hollywood movies and musicals like I am, and in the evenings you tend to watch certain cable channels that feature classic films, well, you usually don't have to wait too long before a minstrel show pops up and Fred Astaire or Judy Garland or Eddie Cantor or Ann Sothern are dancing in front of you in full blackface minstrel regalia, looking so pleased and so very, very happy with themselves. At that point, I usually sink down into my chair in writhing agony, and I'm reaching for the fast-forward button on my remote, but I can't deny what I was seeing. That was the truth of the matter. It was there. It happened. And as shameful as it was, it would be even more shameful to ignore it. Indeed, you can say that in a very real way that for 100 years, minstrel shows were American show business. They were the foundation of the popular music industry. They were the place where popular dance forms were developed and showcased, and they were where the Broadway musical theater, as a commercial enterprise, got its real start. Minstrel shows were an entry point for people, especially working class people of all races, to find their way into show business. To completely exhaust this enormous topic would require a podcast episode that was decades long. There's plenty of scholarship about it, goodness knows. In fact, it's one of the most explored topics in academic theater history research. So I'm not revealing any secret or obscure information here. How can I best approach such a large topic in about an hour's time? Well, a real historical service that I think I can provide to you is to discuss minstrel shows specifically as they occurred in the city of Philadelphia, and how the world of minstrelsy interacted and existed within the context of theater and performance in this city. That's actually something that hasn't really been treated that deeply or specifically, but there are a few notable exceptions, and as we explore this topic and travel into very deep and tangled and contested ground of Philadelphia history, we'll bring a few eminent scholars and their books along with us. I'm very grateful for their expert advice. There are many authors and studies worth mentioning, and as we do every time, I will list them all at the end of the episode's blog post on our website, aithpodcast.com. Take a look at it. The link, as always, is in the show notes. All right, having gathered our guides with us, let us now proceed to the narrative. What was the story of minstrel shows in Philadelphia from the earliest days of its theater history down to the present day? How did minstrel shows fit into the context of the rest of the Philadelphia theater world? How did they begin, and why did they end? Or, if they didn't really end, where did they go? The first actual minstrel troupe, it is generally agreed by historians, was the Virginia Minstrels, 4 white men performing in blackface: Dan Emmett, Billy Whitlock, Frank Brower, and Dick Pelham, who first gave shows in New York City theaters, hotels, and circuses in December of 1842 and January of 1843. Their new act was high-powered and raucous with constant music, jokes, and dancing. The Virginia in their name was meant to represent a certain genteel type of enslaved person, and the minstrel was a reference to several European four-part harmony singing groups that had been touring America using the word minstrels in their name, like, say, the Tyrolese minstrels. And in the personas of the Virginia minstrels, there was also a pointed rebuke to the Hutchison family singers, a famous singing group of their day that advocated Christian values like, not owning people. But unlike them, the Virginia minstrels did not proselytize for women's rights or the abolition of slavery. Instead, the Virginia minstrels gleefully lampooned these sentiments. And in songs like Old Dan Tucker and Jimmy Crack Corn, their lyrics advocated the idea that enslaved people were actually rather fine with their lot in life as long as they were having a good time. The fact that minstrel shows were structured more like concerts than plays is not a coincidence. Minstrel men soon found that they could earn more as concert givers than as mere stock company actors, which they'd been before, much more. In the midst of a generally depressed economy in America, this was a sudden gold mine for formerly marginal clowns and musicians. Immediately, audiences were flocking to hear and see the Virginia minstrels, and by the springtime, they were already touring as stars and headliners to other American cities. By March 16, 1843, the Virginia minstrels, or someone using their name, were playing at a small Philadelphia venue called, significantly, the People's Theater on Arch Street. By April, one of their early imitators, the Kentucky Minstrels, took the next step up the ladder and were performing at the Arch Street Theater, giving a, quote, variety of breakdowns, jigs, songs, etc. These new minstrels were welcomed as being good for any flagging box office by other theater professionals, and we can easily see evidence of this. They were quickly accepted as part of the Philadelphia theatrical world. On October 25, 1843, a new formation of the Virginia Minstrels were playing at the Walnut Street Theater on the very same bill with the respected classical actor George Vandenhoff. In fact, the announcement of their show in the Evening Ledger was right below one for Edwin Forrest, who was doing Metamora at the National Theater, and it was right above one for his great rival, Charles Macready, who was doing Hamlet at the Chestnut Street Theater. 3 days later, both Forrest and Macready were doing the play Richelieu, Forrest at the National, while Macready was doing it at the Chestnut, with Charlotte Cushman, by the way, in the role of Julie de Mortemar. Meanwhile, a few blocks away at the Walnut, the Virginia Minstrels were doing their act, as well as an Ethiopian operetta that they called Oh Hush. By November of 1843, the Virginia Minstrels were playing the National on Chestnut, just down the street from where Macready and Cushman were doing Macbeth. By 1849, a group of minstrels called the New Orleans Serenaders Operatic Troupe were giving a burlesque concert at the stately Musical Fund Hall on Locust Street. The songwriter Nelson Knies shared the strains of his new tunes, I Hear the Hoofs, Rosa Clare, and Nellie Was a Lady. More ominously, he and the others also performed a song called Go Way, Black Man. There's hardly a popular tune written in the middle of the 19th century that didn't first get introduced in or was quickly integrated into a minstrel show. And it's not only those you might easily spot, like Dixie or Camptown Races or Blue Tail Fly. There's also the Yellow Rose of Texas, and I've been working on the railroad, and I'm sorry to report that dear old Christmas standard, Jingle Bells. Yep, These tunes were destined to work themselves deep into our consciousness long after their original context was forgotten. Even today, you probably know a lot of minstrel tunes yourself. You just think about all the songs you learned in summer camp or in elementary school chorus, like Buffalo Gals, Won't You Come Out Tonight? Now, if you think of a song has a traditional folk melody, just Google it or look it up on Wikipedia. It's likely to have been once originally a minstrel tune. And by the way, you might learn that the previous title of Buffalo Gals was Philadelphia Gals. In a time of fuzzy copyright law, there's seldom a definite copyright claim or origin to any of them, although people tried. Minstrel troupes themselves, with their flexible programs, were famous for forming and reforming into new groups and professional arrangements. Within a few years, the original Virginia minstrels had broken up following a tour of England, but dozens of new groups, including the famous Christie's minstrels, were ready to take their place. Christie's minstrels deserves a section all of its own. Edwin Pierce Christie had been born and raised in Philadelphia, as it happens, from a family of Irish background. Indeed, as has been noted by many scholars, it was Irish Americans and Irish immigrants who formed the large majority of early minstrel show performers, bringing their jigs and reels and sentimental song styles, along with a dash of their supposed observations of authentic Southern plantation life. Though in truth, most of these minstrels, like E.P. Christie himself, were from the cities of the North and had never been south of the Mason-Dixon line. But they often lived in quite close proximity with urban black communities, and their clownish parodies of black vernacular speech patterns, dress, and dancing styles were freely lifted from their neighbors. E.P. Christie had left Philadelphia as a young man and had gone to Buffalo, and his early career in minstrelsy was spent in upstate New York. By 1846, he'd moved his troupe to New York City and started incorporating into his show the songs of his friend Stephen Foster, including "Oh, Susanna" and "Old Folks at Home" or "Swanee River." It was Christie who had refined the minstrel show into the exact format we described at the opening of the episode. The line of 12 men in a semicircle of chairs and the 3-act structure. Most importantly, Christie had learned that if your minstrel shows were good enough, you did not have to tour. He was the one who set up shop along Broadway in New York City, where he played shows almost every day, non-stop, 3 times a day. It was a highly lucrative business. In a very real way, the American minstrel show was the beginning of the Broadway musical and the American song industry. Christie had even started to franchise his operation, sending troops to other American cities, which is why, in 1855, a group of Christie's minstrels started performing at Wood's Museum, right next door to Old Drury, the Chestnut Street Theater near 6th Street. But by then, Philadelphia already had its own permanent minstrel company at Sanford's Opera House. This troupe's leader, Sam S. Sanford, took over a former dancing academy in a commercial building on 12th Street, just below Chestnut. He grandly decorated the exterior with bright gas lights and a statue of a seated minstrel hanging out of an upper window holding a huge flag that proclaimed "Sanford's Opera House" to all passers-by. The troupe specialized in burlesques of high cultural events, from operas like La Sonnambula to touring concert singers like Jenny Lind to the visiting Ronzani's Grand Ballet Company at the Academy of Music. Oh, they thrived at the 12th Street location for a few months, gamely changing their act almost every week until, won't you know it, an unfortunate fire in December of 1853 drove them out. Undeterred, Sanford took over the Old Drury, the Chestnut Street Theater, and then did shows there, invading the former seat of high culture in the city. By 1855, as the Chestnut Street Theater was demolished, as we've described before, Sanford purchased a former Presbyterian church on the west side of 11th and Ludlow Streets, just south of Market Street, a building which had already been converted into a stage. In 1807, it too was called Sanford's Opera House, though when Sanford lost control of it due to some financial speculation, he went and built another opera house on Arch and 2nd Street, and that in turn would be destroyed by a fire in 1871. But going back, in the 1850s and 60s, the minstrel show reached its absolute peak as a way to spread music, dancing, and social commentary in Philadelphia. Having spent a lot of time in both digital and physical archives about Philadelphia theater history recently, I can tell you that the amount of documentation from this period is almost overwhelming. The collections of the Free Library of Philadelphia, the Library Company, the Historical Society of Pennsylvania, local university collections, everywhere you look, minstrels, pages and pages of posters, ads, sheet music, memoirs, photos. dozens and dozens of companies either formed in Philadelphia or passed through it on tours. But let's return to that small minstrel theater I mentioned on 11th Street. This establishment would become the longtime home of a succession of resident Philadelphia minstrel companies for the next 5 decades. For a long time, it was run by 2 men, Carncross and Dixie, who catered to the crowds of Philadelphians who continued to flock to see blackface minstrel shows through the 1860s, 70s, and 80s. Every theatrical season, the Carncross minstrels returned with new sketches, new songs, new burlesques, but always in the old-time blackface minstrel format. And their white audiences, by all accounts, loved them. There was a certain sort of childish glee in contemporary descriptions when people wrote down how they felt about going to see a minstrel show. Laughter, joy, and innocent fun are the words you see most often. Invigorating and healthful even. An advertising poster from the 1870s shows a sickly and emaciated group of people going in the front door of the 11th Street Opera House and then emerging afterwards. Healthy, happy, and rounded. Laugh and grow fat was the tagline of many minstrel shows of the era. Frank Dumont took over the company in the 1890s. A native of Utica, New York, Frank Dumont had been a member of various touring minstrel shows since he was a young man. He was ready to settle down into a long-time gig in Philadelphia. Dumont was enthusiastic in his continuing loyalty and advocacy for the minstrel show format. His 1899 how-to book for aspiring minstrel show performers, both male and female, called The Amateur Minstrel Guide and Burnt Cork Encyclopedia, had been a big seller for M. Whitmark & Sons. The publishers even advertised in the back of the book their own branded tambourines and jars of burnt cork makeup. By that time, minstrel shows were fading as professional entertainment in America, but staid old Philadelphia, famously comfortable and set in its ways of doing things, stubbornly held on to its minstrel companies much longer than other American cities. Dumont kept on creating new shows every year, hiring new company members as needed, and writing new material. He authored a popular afterpiece that became a play entitled A Parlor Match. He claimed to have introduced the popular songs Silver Threads Among the Gold and When You and I Were Young, Maggie, into his shows at the 11th Street Opera House, which, by the turn of the century, now bore a huge electric sign on its roof. Dumont's Minstrels. In 1911, this building, which by that point found itself in the heart of Philadelphia's booming department store district, was finally torn down to become a Horn and Hardarts automat. By then, many generations of Philadelphians had seen shows there. In the 1920s, the graphic artist Frank Taylor, a man who lovingly and diligently made detailed renderings of almost every 19th century Philadelphia theater building, God bless him, made a drawing of the old 11th Street Opera House, with Dumont's sign adorning it. Where our mothers and fathers laughed their troubles away, Taylor called the drawing. In fact, by the late 19th and the early 20th century, there was quite a slew of sentimental newspaper articles and drawings and memoirs about the heyday of the minstrel show, which was now fading in importance. When you come to think of it, wrote one newspaper reporter in 1914, it is rather remarkable that we have had our old friends the minstrels with us for more than 60 years. They have weathered every innovation in theatricals, the decline and fall of the stock ventures, the advent of the traveling companies, comic opera, vaudeville, and now even moving pictures. And they are going on night after night. But we've been leaving out a big part of the story. Were not Philadelphia's substantial African-American population highly offended and disdainful of all this racial caricature and cultural appropriation, especially in the years before the Civil War, when chattel slavery held millions of black people in legal bondage? Did others not object to what many have termed the commodification of blackness itself? Even after emancipation, when the struggle for full civil rights of citizenship for African Americans was often a violently burning issue on the streets of Philadelphia, were there not protests in the streets outside all these minstrel shows? Well, for the most part, no. And as we shall discuss next, there is considerable evidence that there were many black performers working in the minstrel genre too, even quite early on. This was much to the discomfort and distress to the small but growing African American intelligentsia. There was a good reason for this discomfort. From the very inception of slavery in America, the performances of dances and songs had been forced on blacks by their enslavers, both as exercise and as a demonstration of their happiness and fitness in the slave markets. The writer William Wells Brown even told of his own experience of leading his fellow enslaved people to create performances for prospective buyers in New Orleans. There has often been a deep distrust of being put on display for the entertainment of whites by black people in America ever since, and we can see that African American journalists had great disdain for such Ethiopian delineators like Thomas Rice and his Jim Crow character. But there were black minstrels performing for the people in their own community, too. In 1849, quite early in the history of minstrel shows, in upstate New York, the orator and journalist Frederick Douglass attended a performance by Gavitt's Original Ethiopian Serenaders, one of the first all-black minstrel troupes. In spite of his distaste at minstrelsy's racist tropes, Douglass decided to go and attend the show because of his, quote, love of music and curiosity to see persons of color exaggerating the peculiarities of their race, close quotes, as he put in his review that ran in his newspaper, the North Star, the following day. Much to Douglass's initial dismay, he strongly felt that the group, quote, exaggerated the exaggeration of our enemies and catered to the lower elements of the baser sort, close quotes. But then Douglass reflected on the political potential of black performance in the harsh realities of America of that time, writing, quote, "It is something gained when the colored man in any form can appear before a white audience, and we think that even in this company, with industry, application, and a proper cultivation of their taste, may yet be instrumental in removing the prejudice against our race." Close quotes. In other words, as the Philadelphia-born and raised cultural historian Alain Locke would later put it, the process was one in which whites had begun by imitating blacks, and then was picked up by blacks imitating whites, imitating blacks, and in this cultural exchange, perhaps some mutual respect might even be gained. And there was much to respect. After all, the 19th century African-American musicologist James Monroe Trotter, who, after also reluctantly attending the performance of a black minstrel troupe in 1878, marveled at the excellent musicianship and the deep musical education of many of the performers he heard. In fact, many other black writers and historians of the day insisted that what made minstrel music and dancing so inherently compelling was, in fact, the very things that it had gathered from African and African-American culture. In Philadelphia itself, William Henry Dorsey, the official custodian of the American Negro Historical Society, seemed very interested in the local appearances of professional black minstrel companies, along with classical music concerts, amateur church socials, and plays, and he pasted many programs of black minstrel shows that he had seen and newspaper articles about them in his voluminous scrapbooks. I've been privileged to look through a microfilm copy of those William Dorsey scrapbooks, thanks to the professional kindness of the librarians at Cheyney University, where they are held. In these books, there seems to be a general ease on Dorsey's part about ethnic humor and cross-cultural impersonation in the late 19th century city of Philadelphia. He even proudly noted in his own handwriting on a playbill for Gilbert and Sullivan's musical The Mikado that it had been staged at Fox's American Theater in 1879 and that all the cast had been colored people of Philadelphia. colored people who were playing Japanese people as burlesqued by white people, but that's the way it was back then. For the black performers themselves, who before the Civil War had not been allowed opportunities in large symphony orchestras or theater ensembles or anything else, this new genre of show business was seen as a chance for economic advancement. And minstrel shows was one avenue in which they naturally felt they could do better than the white men who were blacking up and crudely imitating them. Every group mocked every other group back then. In minstrel shows, instead of just being mocked, blacks could get a chance to make the rest of America listen to the real thing, as it were. But I've gotten a little ahead of myself and started talking about the reaction before I've actually detailed what they were reacting to. In Philadelphia, we know that there were groups of black men, like the ones that Frederick Douglass saw in New York, that organized themselves into occasional minstrel troupes from quite early on, and who even wrote their own songs for the minstrel show genre, because, after all, minstrel shows in that time were the big venue in which popular songs got performed in this era. There was money to be made if you could manage it. True, most early black minstrel groups didn't last very long, not being able to command easy funding to keep their groups going, like their white counterparts. But there were some interesting stories. Richard Milburn, for example, was a Philadelphia African-American barber, known as Whistling Dick, who cut hair in his father's shop on Lombard Street. He performed the guitar in shows for audiences, and he whistled tunes to his customers while working his regular gig. You likely know his most famous tune, Listen to the Mockingbird, which, by the way, we're listening to in the background right now. Listen to the Mockingbird was arranged and printed by a white Philadelphian musician and publisher named Septimus Winner. Winner credited Milburn on the original sheet music even, but later sold the rights to the song, and unfortunately Milburn's name was usually dropped from subsequent printings. But Septimus Winner kept on working. Under the pseudonym Alice Hawthorne, Septimus Winner was apparently writing and publishing the songs known as Where, Oh Where Has My Little Dog Gone?, 10 Little Injuns, and Carry Me Back to Tennessee, perhaps a predecessor to the song Carry Me Back to Old Virginia. Both white and black performers would make for use of Winner's compositions over the years. Listen to the Mockingbird, in particular, became a favorite of country music fiddlers, who usually interpolated a section of bird imitations into the song, exactly as Whistling Dick Milburn had once done in his barbershop on Lombard Street. Most notably, during the American Civil War, in June of 1863, we have an odd account by a white reporter in the theatrical trade publication called the New York Clipper. This article describes a show by a group of black Philadelphians calling themselves the Ira Aldridge Troupe, named, obviously, in tribute to the famous actor, and this group gave a show at Franklin Hall in Philadelphia. Now, Franklin Hall in those days was a large civic meeting place on 6th Street below Arch, but other scholars say that this particular show actually took place at a different Franklin Hall in the 5th Ward of South Philadelphia. By the New York Clipper's account, the Ira Aldridge Troupe seems to have been thrown together for just the occasion, and its advertised instrumentalists in its orchestra had not shown up, except for a couple of fiddlers and a cello player. But they made do with what they had. The audience was a mixture of both black and white people, with a delegation from the Wecaco Volunteer Fire Company in attendance, much to everyone's satisfaction. Male and female singers performed in the show, including a popular ballad, When This Cruel War Is Over, sung by a Miss Burton, which she did in a straightforward conventional style the first time through, and then in an encore of the song, she did it in a more demonstrative camp meeting breakdown in which she moved her body back and forth rhythmically, according to the account. Some of the troupe also did acrobatic tricks involving poles and knives, and then did a farcical skit called The Irishman and the Stranger, in which one black performer did a fair version of an Irish dialect with a costume that used soda crackers as buttons, a decided payback to all those white Irishmen playing black men with woolly-haired wigs and burnt cork in other minstrel shows in the city. The middle part of the Ira Aldridge Troupe's performance was a burlesque on a famous play. I am somewhat amazed to report that the play being parodied was already well known to listeners of this podcast, Metamora, Edwin Forrest's play about the rebellion of the Wampanoag Indians in 17th century Massachusetts. This particular parody was called Red Man of the Forest or The Oath, and the black actor playing the principal role of Red Man reportedly got a huge laugh from the mixed-race audience when he shouted out the line, "I am Manioki, let the pale-face beware." And then, when that was over, there was another display of acrobatics, and then the very final part of the show was a farce about a tailor entitled Jeremiah Backstitch. The white reporter from the Clipper, in his account, allowed that the entire show was all done very well and that he felt some white minstrel performers could benefit from seeing real black performers on the stage. Now, despite some accounts of this performance, when it's used by other scholars and authors to talk about the minstrel shows of this era, I can see no indication that the Ira Aldridge minstrels did any material in blackface or whiteface or redface, and at no point do they seem to have employed the traditional lineup. They didn't have a comic endman or the interlocutor. And it's important to note that both men and women performed in this show, which was not standard practice in the other minstrel shows. Still and all, this article is a fascinating glimpse into the world of Philadelphia working-class entertainment in an era when such things were rarely even mentioned in the major newspapers of the day. I'll put the whole thing on the website if you want to read it yourself. It was after the American Civil War, of course, that professional black performers really became involved in America's minstrel shows, using the by now standard minstrel format, but giving it their own particular twist in its musical stylings and dances and jokes. Troupes of black men crisscrossed the country, usually being described as Georgia minstrels or Callender's minstrels after a particularly famous group. Riding on the popularity of another entertainment phenomenon of the day, the Fisk University Jubilee Singers, many black minstrel troupes began adding gospel material and explicitly religious songs to their shows, which had never before been part of the genre. Furthermore, the military experience of black men in the Union Army during the war was put to use, and minstrel troupes often featured precision marching bands with spectacular drill steps who offered to compete head-to-head with any white band in the towns they visited. Most importantly, by the end of the 19th century, it was black composers and performers, many of them with long experience of performing in minstrel shows, who would eventually bring the energy and rhythms of African American dance and music into the formation of the 20th century American musical. And I have to share, at this point, the story of James A. Bland, the well-known African American songwriter and performer, who had a life story that was closely tied to Philadelphia. Bland is still today famous in Philly for composing the song, "Oh Them Golden Slippers," which has become the theme song of the annual Mummers Parade. Bland was born in Flushing, New York, into a middle-class family. His father, Allen Bland, was one of the first African-American college graduates, who also eventually obtained a law degree from Howard University and became an examiner in the United States Patent Office. But his son, Jimmy's particular talents led him in a different direction in life. When he was 12 years old, and the family was living at that point in Philadelphia at the corner of 5th and South Streets, he first became fascinated with music. One day, the story goes, Jimmy heard an older black man in the neighborhood playing on the banjo and singing minstrel tunes. Jimmy quickly built himself his own banjo from scraps and learned to play it, but the makeshift instrument was destroyed in a fight with a local bully. The young lad was naturally heartbroken, So his father, God bless him, bought him an $8 banjo at a store to make up for the loss. Quite an investment at the time. Later, Alan Bland might have had cause to regret encouraging his son's musical talents. When the family moved to Washington, D.C., James Bland was now playing on the streets and writing his own songs. He was even earning money by joining local minstrel shows whose companies were made up of the quote-unquote authentic Negro minstrels. He enrolled in Howard University along with his father, but was forced to leave because of his involvement in theatrical shows, which violated the code of conduct for the school at that time. James Bland was soon launched on a theater and music career that would take him around the world. He joined the original Black Diamonds minstrel troupe in Boston in 1875, but by 1878 he had joined a much larger group, Sprague's Georgia Minstrels, and already he had composed the song Carry Me Back to Old Virginny. In 1880, Bland joined an even larger and even more successful troupe, Haverly's Genuine Colored Minstrels, which included two of the most famous performers of their day, Sam Lucas and Billy Kersans. The show included an act in which two rival African-American marching bands would enter from opposite sides of the stage and then merge and blend their music and their dancing. In December of 1880, Haverly's Genuine Colored Minstrels, with Bland in their ranks, played the Academy of Music in Philadelphia. By then, this trend for ever larger companies of minstrel troupes had reached such a point that the advertising for the show boasted that there were hundreds of performers on the stage, including 20 endmen, 20 song and dance men, 3 interlocutors, a brass band of 20 musicians, and a chorus of 200 voices. It was billed as a colossal Christmas carnival and included the scenic effects of a moving flatboat and steamboat, and James A. Bland was one of the interlocutors at the Academy for those shows, like literally a central role, who stood in the middle of this huge line and directed the action. And of course, the show featured many of his songs and compositions. In the 1880s and 90s, James Bland left for Europe with a touring company of minstrels, and he stayed abroad for a long time. He achieved such personal success and acclaim that eventually he was even able to stop performing in blackface. He composed, over his lifetime, 600 songs, including Hand Me Down My Walking Cane, In the Evening by the Moonlight, as well as Oh Them Golden Slippers. He played for Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales in England, and those two British royals seem to be quite fond of minstrel acts, really, by the way. Looking over the literature on this subject, there's hardly a famous American minstrel who didn't at some time perform for Vicky and her son Bertie. I think those two must have had a booking agent on Constant Outlook or something. James A. Bland, known as the world's greatest minstrel man, earned a lot of money in his heyday, but unfortunately, like his fellow 19th century songwriter Stephen Foster, he never kept much of it. He was a poor manager of his own material, and he sold the rights to most of his song to publishers for a pittance. And all the money he made in show business was soon spent or otherwise lost. By the early 20th century, with the minstrel boom dying away, Bland returned to America, and he chose Philadelphia for a home, likely because of its large black community and also because it was one of the few cities that still had permanent minstrel troupes performing regularly. In fact, he seems to have worked with Dumont's Minstrel Company, which was by then performing on the corner of 9th and Arch Street. And it was the longtime manager of that company, Frank Dumont, who evidently introduced Bland's song Golden Slippers into the Mummers Parade. Dumont was an enthusiastic mummer in the early days of it, and it is possible that James Bland even marched with Dumont's Fancy Club in both the 1909 and 1910 New Year's Day parades, dressed as a Spanish-American War veteran. But by that point in time, James Bland was quite ill with tuberculosis. He died in 1911 in abject poverty. His friends tried to raise the $25 needed to have him properly buried, but could only come up with $6. He must have had some falling out with Dumont because the minstrel show producer did not step in to help. To save him from the anonymity of a potter's field, a sympathetic funeral director finally secured him an unmarked plot at Marion Memorial Park in Ballackinwood, just outside of the city limits of Philadelphia. In the 1930s, African-American fraternal groups raised money and placed an appropriate marker on the grave. So, we're almost back where we began, with Frank Dumont and his minstrels on Arch Street. Frank Dumont was in his early 70s by the spring of 1919 and had been ill for several months, but he was insisting on overseeing the new St. Patrick's Day show. On March 17th, standing by the front door of the theater, the old-time minstrel man suddenly collapsed. His longtime business manager, Howard Evans, sat him down on a chair in the tiny box office, but Dumont died 5 minutes later. Well, there's no business like show business. Evidently, no one judged a dead man in the lobby as a reason to cancel the non-stop minstrel merriment at Dumont's. According to the story in the newspaper the next day, the death of the venerable minstrel did not interfere with the program. The performances were given as usual, although for several hours his body lay in the building. After his passing, Dumont's company was combined with a minstrel troupe from Atlantic City, led by Emmett Welch. Welch's minstrels apparently kept finding a loyal audience among Philadelphians for the rest of the decade in their bandbox of a theater at 9th and Arch. But soon you didn't need to go to live theater to see the minstrel shows of these small-time Philadelphia guys. By 1927, through that brand new invention, sound movies, you could see and hear Al Jolson in blackface on the big screen in The Jazz Singer. So by January 1929, when Welch's Minstrels gave their last show, those old guys in the company knew it was time to pack it in, long after most other American cities had already done so. But it isn't like minstrelsy went away. Instead, it went everywhere. There were live radio shows on local Philadelphia stations and national networks. There were many, many, many amateur shows by fraternal organizations, both black and white, university sororities, church groups, again, both black and white. When they wanted to have a party and raise some money, well, heck, you just put on a minstrel show and everybody will come. A simple internet search for the terms minstrel show and Philadelphia on almost any newspaper database will bring up literally thousands of hits. Let's pick out two of them. In 1932, we can see that the radio station WIP 610 on the AM dial, Philadelphia's pioneer voice, was presenting Charlie Stark's Minstrels at 5 p.m. in the evening, describing them as a genuine old-fashioned minstrel show with end-men, line-men, and a real minstrel band. And in June of 1935, we can note that the Philadelphia Tribune, the longtime African-American newspaper of the city, had a story about the Octavius V. Caddo Lodge of the Elks Club, who were giving a Mardi Gras and minstrel show to celebrate its 29th anniversary. We could go on, but there's just so much. Minstrels were everywhere in America. They were all over Broadway shows and Hollywood movies up until the middle of the century. And certain aspects of things you would think couldn't be the legacy of minstrels, like university fight songs, the format of the Grand Ole Opry, and many, many skits on television. Oh, they still show the format's continuing deep influence. Beginning in the 1950s or thereabouts, there was a developing consensus that at least white people performing in blackface was now unacceptable. Largely due to the concerted efforts of the NAACP, churches, social clubs, and other institutions were persuaded to stop fundraising with minstrel shows. In the 1960s, an attempt by a white fraternity at Temple University in Philadelphia to hold a minstrel show at their frat house on campus was met with a substantial demonstration from black community organizers. There were pointed conversations within the Philadelphia black community, too. In 1978, a new play called The Last Minstrel Show starring the actress Della Reese, played at the New Locust Theater, just next door to the Academy of Music, where James Bland and Haverly's Minstrels had appeared a century before. It was a show about a group of African-American minstrels in Cincinnati doing a final tour in the year 1926. It met with some interest from Black Philadelphia audiences of the time, but also some resistance from many others, too, who felt that this was a topic from history that did not need any further reenactment. It was doing more harm than good. However, we might note that in the year 2012, the Kander and Ebb musical, The Scottsboro Boys, which used a Brechtian-style minstrel show format to tell the story of a famous civil rights case from the 1930s, played at the Philadelphia Theater Company on Broad and Lombard Streets to generally rapturous reviews. And as we learned 2 episodes ago, of course, the biggest ongoing inheritance of minstrelsy in Philadelphia was and is the Mummers Parade that marches right up Broad Street every New Year's Day. Even though in 1963 the decision was made by Philadelphia's city government to ban blackface at the Mummers Parade, it is an inescapable fact that minstrel performance traditions are still there, deep in the DNA of the event. All those big hats and shiny costumes and the cakewalk struts and the string bands with all their banjos and their comic brigades, these are cultural practices and norms which come from somewhere. They are exchanges between social groups, perhaps, and they change and morph and evolve over time as our ethical boundaries and our moral tolerance for certain performances and their traditions change. Whether you think that's an inherently bad thing or an inherently fascinating thing, well, that's up to you, but I'm always on the side of people knowing the deep and detailed history about any topic first, and then maybe we can make better decisions about where we go from here. I thank all of you for your interest and your kind attention, and I've done my best to bring some light to the subject and craft some narrative order onto an enormous and unruly trove of available information. It's been quite a journey. I'm Peter Schmitz. Our podcast theme music, as well as all the other sound engineering and sound effects, are created by Christopher Mark Colucci. We'll have lots of great new episodes coming up next month, and we urge you all to keep listening, to keep sending us those supportive emails. We love those. We keep posting reviews on iTunes and elsewhere about us. You find us on Patreon. Keep following our daily posts on Facebook and on Twitter. And most of all, keep supporting your local theater companies, whether in Philadelphia or anywhere else you might be listening. Thank you. And we'll see you again real soon on another Adventures in Theater History, Philadelphia.